All right, welcome everyone to this live event that we're doing. It's going to be about how to ace your nursing job interview. And just to do some quick introductions, my name is Sara Fung. I'm a registered nurse and I've been working about 16 years now. I have worked at the bedside, I've worked in leadership. I currently run my own company. It's called the RN Resume, where we help things or nurses with all things careers. And I have a guest today, and I'm going to let Catie quickly introduce herself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Catie Harris. I'm owner and CEO of Nursepreneurs, and we help nurses set up businesses, but I have a team of 20, so I have done a crap ton of interviewing. Plus, I used to be the senior manager for talent acquisition at Walmart headquarters, and we interviewed nurse practitioners into our clinics. So I have been in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews, so we have lots of things to share here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me. I thought this was absolutely perfect when I heard that you actually had been a recruiter for nurses at some point. And now I help nurses with interviewing and all things like resumes and, things that we wish that we had learned in nursing school or out on the job, but we haven't. And just before I get started, I wanted to let everyone know watching today, we are taking live questions and we want to know a little bit more about you as well. So as we're going along, if you could just pop into the chat where you are watching from, that would really help us. I know we've got nurses from all over that want to hear what we have to say. So if people want to just quickly put in the chat where they are tuning in from, that would be amazing. And if there are any questions as we're going along, feel free to put those in the chat as well. We want to make sure we get to all of your questions. But before we do that, maybe Catie, you could tell me a bit more about this experience you have with hundreds of interviews. When you say hundreds, I truly believe you. So what has all that been like?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, so my first segue into this, because to be honest, as a nurse, I never had to really do a resume, or it was one of those resumes that was just, because I was in a place where they were so desperate for nurses, they were just like, all right, you're a warm body, come, stay with us, or come work with us. Or I worked with the same group for so long that, I never had given my resume much thought until, I applied for a position with Walmart. And I had to take a serious look at the resume and really think about what it was that they wanted to see in order to hire me. And then as the senior manager for talent acquisition at Walmart, my job was to hire nurse practitioners into positions. And all of a sudden, I just got this whole epiphany about what it was that really made a resume good, because being on the opposite side of that was really enlightening, to be honest. So we would put a call out for a nurse practitioner position in one of the clinics, and these were all down south. One position, I would get like 100 resumes, and you just can't go through 100 resumes. I mean, you can, but you can't. You have to do some things that are very superficial in the beginning to wheedle that pile down. And one of the first things that I did was we only hired family nurse practitioners. And I'll tell you right now, over 50% of the resumes didn't tell me what type of nurse practitioner they were, because if they were adults, we couldn't hire them. Acute, we couldn't hire them. Women's health, we couldn't hire. They had to be family. And, so I was able to throw 50% of them away before I even got to the pile, but just because they didn't tell me what I needed to know. And that sounds terrible, but at the same time, you have to think about what it is that the person is hiring for, and then make it the least amount of work possible for them to choose you.
I totally know what you mean. I call it reducing the friction. Like, a lot of people will send me their resumes when they want me to help them with, and they say, oh, it's there, but it's on the second page, or I have to read between the lines, or it's at the very bottom. And it's like, no, if someone can't tell within 10 seconds what kind of nurse practitioner you are, for example, that's going to get thrown out, or it's not going to be read. So I think it's just being really intentional with every word on the paper and being really intentional with the space. And so I guess my story with how I got started with interviews is I used to be in nursing leadership. I wasn't a manager, but I was asked to sit in a lot of interviews, just being a second body. And I got to see a lot of people who I could tell were really great nurses with not so great resumes and not so great interviewing skills. And I just thought to myself one day, if only somebody had helped them or coached them, I think they could have done a much better job. And then I started to think, well, maybe that person could be me. And so that's kind of how this all got started. And I think that we often, as nurses, we tend to not want to sell ourselves or worry that we're bragging or think that people should be able to tell what our accomplishments are by our resumes. But really, you have to sell yourself in an interview. And just before I go any further, I'm just going to put some comments here about where people are listening from. So we've got someone from Northern Virginia, someone from Toronto, my neck of the woods, Calgary, Alberta, someone from Algeria. So that's interesting, all the way overseas. Someone from Guernsey, and we've got another one from Toronto, someone from Ontario. And so yeah, that's great. We've got listeners from all over. And again, feel free to type in your questions as you think of them, and we'll get to them as we move along. But I thought I wanted to ask you, Catie, about what are some of the biggest struggles or challenges you've seen when doing interviews?
When doing the actual interviews is really having people articulate their strengths. And I think a lot of times it's because they haven't, they know what their strengths are, but I don't know if it's one of those things where we, like you said, we don't want to sell ourselves too hard in an ironic way, or brag about stuff. But I mean, this happened to me. I teach leadership as well at the local university, and I have a student in one of my courses who I know is amazing, right? And so I had suggested he wanted to do an internship with Nursepreneurs. So I had suggested that he, apply, because I have an operations manager, and put his resume in. And my operations manager threw his resume out, and I was like, oh, what happened, to so and so? And she's like, oh, that resume that didn't fit the bill at all. And I was like, well, but he's amazing, and actually he's working with us now. And but that didn't come across at all, because he listed off of the hospitals where he worked before, and that has nothing to do with the actual position. But when they actually got him in the interview, they were blown away by him. He was amazing. He's still amazing to this day, still with us, and he's been a huge asset to the team. But the resume didn't reflect that. Him getting to the seat to have the interview to sell his strengths was his superpower, but getting past the resume piece was very difficult.
Yeah, and I think that on my side, I help nurses with interview coaching. And one of the areas where I feel like we spend a lot of time on is how to answer questions about conflict and about their weaknesses. I find that nurses in general tend to avoid conflict, so they don't really have examples. And when they do have examples, they're worried about saying the wrong thing or making themselves seem like they're not the right candidate by bringing up conflict. But of course, we know that's part of life and everyone's got conflict and none of us are perfect. So, do you have any suggestions or tips on how people can answer those, or maybe examples of good responses that you've heard to those questions?
Yeah, that is a hard one. I struggle with that one too, because you want it to be a real example, but at the same time, you do have to be careful how you respond to that, because one, you can have the superficial kind of like, well, I work too hard, or something that's just kind of, it feels like a fluffy response and not a really thoughtful response. So I think your best thing to do is kind of wordsmith it, right? Like, you have all your strengths, and I would highly recommend writing all of your strengths down, and don't stop until you get to 50 strengths. I mean, just keep writing them. And then on the other hand, let's look at some of your weaknesses. And I've done the Kolbe-A index test. I don't know if you guys have done that before, but it's a test that evaluates your strengths, and then it tells you where you're not so strong. And one of my weakness areas, I'm a very, very strong quick start, so I can start things really, really fast, but my follow through is not so great. So how could I turn that around? And I tell people I'm an ideas person. Like, if you have anything that you want to brainstorm, I'm your gal. Like, let's talk about it. Let's bash it out, but I am not your detail person. Like, don't ask me to write the SOP for it, because it's going to be a disaster. So I think highlighting that, and you have to know what kind of position you're going for. If I'm going for a position that's very detailed oriented, that's a bad example, right? But it's also one of those things that you should be applying for jobs, and know what they are. And I think that's part of your interview process too, is understanding what exactly this job is and if it aligns with your strengths more so than your weaknesses, because you don't want to work against yourself with a job that's focused on areas that you're not strong in.
Right, right. And some of the things that I tell nurses is you can talk about the weakness, but then focus on what are you doing about it. So your example that you gave, you're a starter, but maybe not someone who follows through. So rather than leaving that answer on a negative note, maybe you can focus on the fact that you're aware of it. This is what I've actively done to improve myself. This is what I'm continuing to do. And give the interviewer confidence that you are still the right person for the job, even though you may have this awareness of something that you're not the best at.
Oh,
So
I like that. You're good at
yeah.
this.
Yeah. So I call it the SAR framework. So SAR. So S is situation, A is action, and R is resolution. So and I find that sometimes nurses get too much into the weeds about the scenario, like they're giving all these irrelevant details, and it's kind of eating away at time they could be talking about what they're doing about it. So I also let people know when I start to do coaching, if I feel they're a talker, we gotta keep on track. We can't have 15 minutes go by to answer a single question because likely there are other questions that need to be asked as part of this interview. So I also talk about trying to read nonverbal body language, whether you're in person or virtual, trying to read the body language and see, like, are they trying to cut in because they need to ask the next question, or are they still writing and are they interested in hearing what it is you have to say? So I think just practicing and being aware of how much time you have is also important.
That's huge. I mean, we did have an interview and we didn't hire her for that exact reason because we only got like one interview question in and she was just going on and on and on. And I feel like sometimes you think you're in an interview and the pressure's on you to speak, but it's a two-way street, and you always have to appreciate that you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you.
Right, right. And I think it's also just checking in, right? Like, and I don't know if this is the right approach, but saying, did that answer your question? Or can I provide more information before you go on for another 5 minutes? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's also, I think it's like you said, it should be a conversation. It can't be one person doing 99% of the talking and the other people that can barely get a word in edgewise.
Yeah, I'm in terms of reading body language. Do you have any specific tips for something like that?
Well, I think if it's in person, right, you can look to see, because I've been a part of a lot of panel interviews or interviews with one person and two people doing the interview. And typically, what happens, at least in the hospital setting, is you have a set of predetermined questions. And as the person speaking, you write down the answers. And so I think if you see that person has stopped writing, or if they're checking their watch or they're checking their phone, maybe it's because what you're saying is no longer, like, you basically answered the question and they want you to move on. And really what your telltale sign should be is if they have to cut you off to get to the next question, that really is you have spoken too much. And you need to just give them the answer, and again check in to see, did I answer the question? Would you like me to give another example? I think that's good, because
I
this
like
way
that.
it's more of a give and take, right? It's not just go, go, go. And I think a lot of nurses just, they want to fill the silence because they're uncomfortable. So number one, they either talk a little bit too much, or they start what I call spiraling. And if they feel nervous because they can't answer the question, they kind of just morph it into an answer about something else that doesn't actually answer the question. And I know that as an interviewer, we would often try to evaluate this person after and say, so what was the answer to the question? Because they didn't actually answer the question. They started talking about something else entirely. So I do think it's important to kind of take a step back, and if you're nervous, kind of reframe yourself, or maybe ask for clarification on the question. Or I think there's many different approaches you can take depending on where you're at in the situation.
Yeah, yeah, I like that a lot.
So we have other people that are from New York. Oops, where are we? Oh, and Casey's from Orlando. And then we've got someone from Southern California, Toronto. Mira says she likes the SAR approach. And we got someone from Alberta. I think Ghana is probably the farthest away we have right now, at least from me. Northern Virginia. And James, hi James. So James and I have done a LinkedIn Live before too, and he's a big supporter of nurses. Um, so do you have any sort of other thoughts in general when it comes to interviewing? Because I know this is kind of a challenge for a lot of nurses. A lot of nurses will say to me, I've never actually interviewed before because I've been at the same organization my whole career and I just kind of moved from one unit to another. So for someone who hasn't interviewed for a long time, like have there been any sort of trends in interviewing that you can speak to or just any sort of general tips?
Well, I mean, I honestly think that you need to go back to the basics. One, you want to dress the part for the interview. I mean, first impressions are lasting impressions. So, I always show a lot of times, like for my own class, a picture of a man or a woman in a suit and somebody hanging out in jeans and a sweatshirt, right? Like it matters how you present yourself to begin with. And second is practicing, because you don't want to just wing these things. You don't want to just take the questions ad hoc, right? You should anticipate the questions and curate a response, because I mean, it's very, very difficult when you're nervous or you're in front of let's say a panel, and they start asking you questions. I mean, that's hard to think on your feet, like especially if you're really nervous, your mind's blank and you're like, I don't know, and that's the worst thing that you can do. Like if you've gone over and you've thought of stories and you've thought of ways to explain yourself or explain weakness, I mean, strengths and weaknesses, that's like the bare minimum that they're going to ask you. Like, of course they're going to ask that, right?
Mhm.
And you can think of your own questions. What would you want to know for somebody coming into this position? And they want to know that, are you likable? Are you nice? Do you have high standards? Are you a high quality type person? Are you going to get the job done? So what types of questions could they ask related to that? And you want to practice the answers, because you don't need a word for word answer. You don't have to memorize the answer, but you should have some inkling of how you're going to answer those types of questions.
Right. And I think this actually is not common knowledge. So, what you've just said about talking about your strengths, that is not common knowledge for nurses preparing for interviews. I think a lot of nurses actually do wing it, even though they really want the job and it's very important to them. They just aren't even sure what will be asked. So, I think as a bare minimum, you should prepare for, tell me a little bit about yourself. And this is more meant as an icebreaker question, not to go into your whole life story about why you became a nurse, but just sort of like an icebreaker question. Having some examples of strengths and weaknesses as well as conflict, I usually recommend around 3 possible answers in case you get nervous or one wasn't exactly what they were looking for. And really just something as basic as, why do you want the job? Why should someone hire you? Right? I think you should be prepared for that, along with possible clinical scenarios if this is a bedside job. And I think another question I get a lot, and maybe you can help with this, Catie, is, should you be bringing references to the job interview?
Hmm. It certainly makes things easier. If somebody handed me a list of references with their names and phone numbers, and at some level, I might be less likely to follow through calling those people, because you were so organized and brought the list of people, as opposed to if I had to follow up with you, it's just a pain in the butt.
Okay, it's good to know, because I've told people, please don't include references anymore on resumes, but it's good to know that if they brought them to the interview, that would be a sign of, you're well organized and someone that can get something done.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think you don't have to hand all that stuff over, but you can certainly have it in case somebody asks you for it, and then it's just kind of like, oh, wow, okay, great.
Okay, and then Casey actually has a question. How about tips for a brand new nurse or brand new NP with or without prior RN experience? Any sort of tips?
And then, so going for like a basic RN, well, so an NP would have RN experience, right? Unless they're family
Mhm.
nurse practitioners, they can go straight through, right? I think you would probably rely heavier on your clinical practicum experience and character references or features, where you are a take charge type of person, or, and a lot of that comes out too, especially in leadership type positions, whereas, your past, what you've done in the past, maybe not as important as the skill sets that you have developed in order to do the job at hand. And that might be the same case for new NPs and new RNs.
Yeah, and I think a lot of nurses these days are coming from other careers. So if nursing is your second or even third career, you might want to draw on some of your past experiences and transferable skills that you have for an NP position. And Casey had another question, or someone with a career gap. So I do get this a lot because some nurses might have taken time off to have kids or care for an elderly relative. A lot of nurses travel because of their spouses, so they do have either career gaps or multiple jobs in a short period of time. So are there any sort of suggestions you have for that?
So for a career gap, yeah, I mean, for someone like that, one, it would be nice to know that they've kept up or in the process of refreshing their skill set if that's required. But honestly, when I'm interviewing people, I'm interviewing the person and not so much the skills per se, right? If they've gone to nursing school, they've gone to nurse practitioner school, there's a base competency that's assumed. And depending on the position, it really comes down to, is this person likable? Are they going to fit in well with the culture where we are? Are they eager and enthusiastic for this position? There's a lot of personal qualities that I would want to see, that I would use to differentiate different candidates as well.
Yeah, and I think that when someone gets brought in for an interview, you have more or less what they're looking for on paper. And the fact that they just want to see what your personality is like, will you gel with the team? This is someone you might have to be working with all day, every day. So you kind of want to know that there's someone you want to work with. And I think the part about being enthusiastic and passionate is kind of underrated, because I've been in interviews where people look perfect on paper. They answered all the questions well, but they just didn't seem excited about the job.
Yeah.
Right. And that's something that you can eat. That doesn't require special skill. You just actually need to be excited about the job and show that interest. So if anyone's listening, please take that away. I think that's something that we can all
Yeah.
benefit from.
I've been on interviews where I was so excited, like I wanted to hire the person straight from the resume, and then I got on a call with them, and I was like devastated. It was horrible. There just wasn't the enthusiasm, or the resume exaggerated their knowledge or their skill set, or something along those lines, and it's really, really upsetting.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. How about a bedside nurse applying for a management role? They want examples how you should lead. Any advice? So I know I've gotten this question before from other nurses who are trying to get their first non-bedside job. And for me, it would be emphasizing even non-formal leadership roles. So if you've ever done charge, if you've been a preceptor, if you've worked on any committees or done any special projects as part of your bedside role, you can definitely emphasize that. I know that when I was a bedside nurse, I joined all kinds of committees. It was actually like a lot, but it was because I wanted to eventually move into leadership, and I do think it helped. So that's probably important. Catie, if you have any other comments, feel free to jump in
Yeah, I
too.
do. I mean, and this again is where one of that team member of ours that had sent in his resume, and it just had his nursing bedside experience, and he was in competition with somebody else whose resume was sent in. And I don't know if you teach this or not, but she had used an objective, right? Like the objective was to do this, that, and this was her skill set. That was like the top of the resume. And the skill set was experienced in project management, which all nurses are like top tier project managers. Okay. You have done project management your entire nursing career. That's all you do is manage the patient and deal with all kinds of problems that come in. So you're a problem solver, project manager, and you can deal in a variety of different computer systems, skill sets. So part of it is knowing the job at hand, right? Knowing what leadership position that you're going for and what skill set is required to do that job, and then emphasizing those skill sets. So are you savvy in, I don't know, like project management tool sets, or can you, jump into a couple and learn them? Are you self-starter? These types of skill sets. And when that woman's resume came in, I was like, she was another one that I'm like, oh my God, I love her resume. I want to hire her. We got her on the phone. She was fine. It didn't work out. The personality piece of it didn't end up working out. And we moved this other nurse into that spectrum. But her resume just screamed, like everything she said. I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what we need, And it
Mhm.
didn't matter where she worked or what she did before. I don't remember where she worked beforehand. All I know is that she said the things that I wanted to hear.
Amazing. I love that. Okay, so another question, how to ask more hard to ask questions like pay, bonuses, scheduling PTO within an interview.
I mean, I feel like some of these don't really belong in the interview. It really comes from HR, or at least at Walmart. Like, I didn't have any control over their pay and bonuses. I just had control over whether they got hired or not.
Yeah, I agree. So I think a lot of these jobs, you typically have a screening interview beforehand with someone from HR. So these are questions I would ask HR. Like you said, there's a lot that needs to be addressed in an interview. So unless this is something that you need to ask right then and there, I probably would leave it for either before or after. Like maybe even at the job offer, then you could ask about these types of things.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of stinks because I get where you're coming from. Like, I'd want to know that up front, but you have to kind of play the game and go through the process and be offered the job first, and then you can start negotiating with HR. But if somebody brought that up during an interview in Walmart, it wouldn't have gone over well.
hmm That kind of leads right into the next question. So, what is a good way to approach the salary during an interview? So, I guess what we're saying is you
What are you
should not,
offering?
I guess you should not bring this up in an interview. It should be asked before, like maybe even before the interview is scheduled, if this is something that's really important to you and there is a minimum salary you're looking for. Probably that question would be best for HR because in order for a job to be posted, there is a internal range, right?
Right.
That we would know, the organization would know before the job could even be posted. So if you're having that conversation about what you need as a minimum before you schedule the interview, I think that would be a good idea.
Right. And you also need to do a little research, and it's way easier nowadays with the internet than it was way back like 20 years ago. But you can look up ranges of salaries and expectations. I mean, you might not get it to the dollar, but you'll get a range like, is this position typically pay 70,000 or does it pay 100,000? Or, are you looking at the $150,000 range? Management positions should be over like six figures. To go into that type of leadership or management unless you're like in a really small town. But all of that stuff is typically public knowledge. You can go on most hospital sites and see what the CNO and the CMO and all those people, the CEO, are making, and get a ballpark range.
Right. And where I live in Ontario, there's something called the Sunshine List. So for all public sector employees that are making over 100,000, you can actually search this list publicly and it's there. So I think that would be one thing. And also on LinkedIn, you can look at different insights, right? So there's definitely a range. You can network a little bit and connect with people that have your ideal job maybe and ask what is an appropriate range for this type of job. So I don't want people to sell themselves short, but just know that there is always a range because you're bringing different knowledge, skills, and expertise, and that that has to be looked at accordingly. So I think we kind of answered this question already. How do you move from bedside to leadership positions?
Yeah, and I would
Yeah.
just to add to that, it helps
Mhm.
to know what position you're looking for, and sometimes what you can do is just, uh, if you really want that position, one, I would try and get to know that person, maybe ask them how they got to that position, even if it's not in the place where you want to work, but find people that are in that position. There are probably a million LinkedIn groups for whatever position that you're looking for, and you can get to know those people, what they do every day, and what skill set is necessary. And then wherever you have a lack of certain skills, I would start working towards getting those skill sets, and then just start applying for those positions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Claudia says adding the project management piece would be something that most nurses would not consider that they have. So this is a great tip. And I hear this a lot too, where when I try to help nurses find work from home jobs and I tell them that computer skills are important, even things like Microsoft Office, right? They say, well, I never use this program at work. It's like, okay, but have you used this in your personal life? Because if you know how to use, let's say, Microsoft Excel, but you didn't learn it at work, I still think it's worth including on the resume.
Oh yeah.
Um, just like speaking another language, you probably learned another language just growing up in a household where that language was spoken. That doesn't make it any less valuable just because you didn't learn it at work. So
Right.
I want nurses to kind of think outside the box, like even your volunteer work. Like if you have managed projects as part of volunteering, that's still worth mentioning if you don't have any other experience. And I had a question recently from a nurse that says, she said to me, how hard can I brag about myself in an interview? And I said, that is your only job in the interview. If you have to, like, you don't need permission. They're asking you to sell yourself. So please sell yourself as much as possible. Maybe you don't want to mention the same thing 10 times in a row, but certainly this is your opportunity to sell yourself as much as possible, and maybe change your mindset around what bragging is, because it's not a bad thing when you're being asked to talk about your accomplishments.
Yeah, and it helps to write that kind of stuff down because you have probably minimized your own accomplishments without realizing it, and you take it for granted. Like maybe you have this honor and that honor and whatever the case may be, even the Daisy Award or something. Like all of that speaks volumes to the quality of your person, and it's worth mentioning. But I do want to say, Sarah, that back to the skill set, like you mentioned Microsoft Office, and Microsoft Office has been with us for what, 20, 30 years, whatever. But I'll tell you, to this day, I'm still like blown away and amazed by anybody that could work with an Excel spreadsheet. And like it is like hands down the most amazing skill set. So if you are even remotely decent and you can actually upload a file into Excel spreadsheet, like that's amazing. It's
Yeah.
still people are still impressed. I'm impressed. I mean, I've literally hired people to help me with Excel spreadsheet. Like that's their only function, is to do my Excel spreadsheets, because I hate it. So if you have that skill set, I would like show off.
Absolutely. And another comment here from Stephanie: I've been passed up for a job where master's is preferred and not required. I don't have a master's, and in comparison, I clearly had more experience than the other person, but had no experience. Oh, but the other person had no experience and was hired because of the master's, because they looked better on paper. How can I conquer this in a future situation?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen this, and you have to remember that the interview people are they're more they're human, and the reasons other people get hired aren't always readily apparent. I've been in interviews where there was one nurse who was clearly superior. It was a management position in the MS field, for a nurse practitioner, but she had been there for 20 years, had worked under the best of the best, started programs from scratch, whatever. And the competition was a brand new nurse practitioner who was young and bubbly and happy. And they hired the young and bubbly, happy one, which was ridiculous. I mean, because there was no comparison between the two. But they all thought she was cute and bubbly, and that's why they hired her. And it ended up in disaster. So, but I see that mistake happen again and again and again. They choose people because their energy level, or they made them feel happy, or like, as humans, I mean, the logical choice, you probably would have been the logical choice, but we're human and we make emotional choices, whether it's buying something or hiring somebody. We want to get somebody that has an emotional connection with you, and if you can in some way, shape, or form do that on an interview, your odds are much better of getting that job.
Actually, that's why I've heard that some resumes still include things like hobbies and interests, because you're hoping to make a personal connection with someone on the interview panel. And I know in one case, the nurse that we interviewed had played hockey in the past, and there was a panelist whose kids played hockey, and she instantly was drawn to this nurse because of that. It had
Mm-hmm.
nothing to do with the job, but it actually there was a connection there that we couldn't deny, and so that helped that person get the job. And I know that's not what we all want to hear, but sometimes it does happen. Okay, so are you good for a couple more questions,
Yeah,
Catie?
absolutely.
Okay, so DP is asking, how do you answer what would your goals be for the first 3 months in a leadership position? So I think in leadership positions, there's a lot of emphasis on what you can do in the first 90 days, probably why they're asking this question. So in leadership, when you move from bedside, it's very much focused on results and your ability to deliver. So they want to know that you have given it some thought to what you would accomplish in the first 90 days. And it doesn't have to be something earth shattering, I don't think. But probably what you would want to do is start getting to know the people, getting to know the unit, what kind of work is being done, and maybe one small accomplishment that you could accomplish in the first 3 months.
Yeah.
But it's a bit hard to say without knowing what the actual job is.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you there. And to be honest, like the leadership position is all about, like Sarah said, getting results. And there's going to be ongoing projects, and you're likely being hired into a leadership program in order to take over. So they're going to want to know, like, that you would want to know who's involved in this project, right? Where are we? What are the milestones? Are they attainable? Are we on budget? Like all of those things, like you have to go in and do like a massive assessment of where you are, and then not restructure everything, but like go in and make a plan to achieve the goal, or say, hey, this, you guys bit off way more than you could chew. Like this, we can't accomplish this in this amount of time, but we can accomplish this. And they want to take charge. I know from my own business, I struggle with this a lot, because I'll have people come in and they're just kind of like, well, tell me what to do. And I'm like, no, like that's why we hired you into a leadership position, because I want you to come in and fix it. So if you
Right.
can go in and show that you're a fixer, like I can't spoon feed you everything. Like I need somebody that, and I feel like I'm interviewing whoever's here right now. I need somebody that says, I can do it, I can figure it out, and I can have it done on time.
Absolutely. I think there's just a shift again from bedside mentality where when you're working at the bedside, you can go home and not have to bring work home with you. You get to go home and come back fresh and take a new patient, and you don't bring that baggage back with you. But in a leadership position, you have projects that are counting on you. So sometimes you may bring work home with you because you're the one that's on the line. You're the only one that's going to be able to deliver this project. You can't just hand it off to someone because you're done for the day. So I think just thinking about it that way, there has to be continuity and you have to be accountable for everything that you do in leadership. So we've got one more question from Mira. How about moving from management to clinical? So we're going the other way now. After over 5 years, how do you convince the interviewer that you are still capable of doing clinical work?
I mean, I honestly would say your enthusiasm to get back into it would be enough for me, to be honest.
I agree. Like I think that like I did camp nursing this past summer, and I feel like a lot of the skills I had, like even with wounds, they were rusty, but they were still there. I just had to actually use that part of my brain again. So if you can just show people that you're willing to learn, that you're enthusiastic, and tell them why you want to be back at the bedside, and if there are any sort of refresher courses that you can take on certain skills, depending on where you want to go, that might help too.
Yep.
Okay. Oops, where did I? Oh, what are your thoughts? Claudia wants to know, what are your thoughts, including your photo on a resume? I have heard conflicting ideas. So everything that I've heard personally is that you should not include a photo on a resume, especially for the Canadian and US job market. You don't want to create any kind of bias related to your ethnicity or your age or anything that can be gleaned from a photo.
Yep, I agree.
So I know in some other countries it's the expectation, to include your picture and date of birth. We don't want any of that, at least in North America, because we want it to be as kind of unbiased as possible. So LinkedIn is a different story. You can include your picture. Actually, you should include a photo on LinkedIn, but definitely not on a resume. Also, from a space perspective, it takes up a lot of space, which you should be using to emphasize your qualifications and your skills. Okay. I think that's oh, one more question. How would the interviewee close the interview? An elevator speech?
Yeah, I mean, I think a summary of your strengths and why you're the right person for the job would be an excellent way to end the interview.
I have heard that at the end of the interview, if there's time for questions, it's always good for the interviewee to have some questions for the panel. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it shows that you've actually done some research, that you've invested in the interview, and that this isn't like the 14th interview of the day and you're just like, God, you want to make them feel special. And I feel like if you do that, you've researched it, you've put a lot of effort into this position because you thought it was worth it, that will come through.
I totally agree. So I'm glad that we were able to have this interview, and hopefully everyone listening got a lot of information out of this. I know I definitely did. Thank you so much, Catie, for your knowledge, skill, and expertise. Where can people find you if they want to know a bit more about you or connect with you?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're absolutely on LinkedIn as Nursepreneurs, and our website is nursepreneurs.com.
Amazing. And if people want to get a hold of me, this event obviously is taking place on LinkedIn, so you can add me or message me on LinkedIn. My website is thernresume.com, all one word. If you're interested in anything new and upcoming, I do have a new group that's launching called Nurses Breaking Free to help you find your dream job in a community type setting of nurses supporting other nurses. So you can get more information on my website or by sending me an email. And if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to contact one of us and we'd be happy to address it for you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.